Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about human rights and government policy. And welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. Of course, I am your host, Michael Clogs. And we've heard about this new variant, the new Omicron variant, and what does it mean? How much more dangerous it is? Are the vaccines going to be effective? There are lots and lots of questions out there, and we're going to hear from the WHO and the Pan American Health Organization to help answer some of these questions, because as we have found out, that Omicron variant has been found in the borders of Canada. So we need to figure out what that means, and we need health officials to be telling us what some of that means, and we also need to do our own research into what is going on. We need to not only listen to local health officials on what their data is, but we also need to expand that globally so that we understand what is happening, so that we can compile our own research to decide what is best for our homes, what is best for us at this. Of course, this is a holiday season. How do we gather our families together? How do we have the events that we all love to have? In one of the press conferences, the question was asked by a citizen and journalist in Brazil about, of course, their cultural iconic celebration of Carnival. How do they do that? Can they gather and dance in the streets like Carnival is famed to be done? How do we do these things? How do we do that? How do we protect our most vulnerable? How do we keep up the rates of public health measures? We'll hear that blanket travel bans are probably not going to be effective, and we're also going to hear one of the reasons why they may not be effective is because the variant may have already entered within your borders because we've already been traveling around. The variant could have appeared long before it was detected by South Africa, Botswana, who valiantly, both of these countries ran up the flag straight to the world to say, hey, we got a new variant of concern out here. We need to take a good look at it. There's a lot out there. Also, we heard that there were medications out there to help cut the effects of COVID-19, and we haven't heard anything more about them. Why haven't health officials talked about how they're dispensing these medications to help people, especially people that may be suffering from long effects of COVID earlier in the pandemic? We are hearing about how children are ready to be vaccinated, and there's another doctor out there who's going to explain what the vaccine actually means, what the spike proteins in the vaccine versus the spike protein that's actually live and in the virus, what all this actually means to us, and how it should be helping us decide on the course of action for our families. So there's a lot of information out there we need to learn how to take it in, digest it, and then make our decisions. We also need to ensure that our governments are being transparent about the data that they're sharing it without the scope of propaganda and without the scope of corporate directives to sell us things that we may or may not need. Now, there are a lot of people out there who are completely anti-vaccine. We are not those people. We don't believe that the vaccines are necessarily a bad thing. We do believe that each individual has to decide for themselves, and that should be a private matter. So, while there have been some questions out there about why hasn't the international communities, the global communities, issued some sort of an ID that identifies those who have been vaccinated across and around the world. And these IDs may be within the violation of our privacy and our rights. Our governments need to focus more on helping bring people together, united in solving the problem that is COVID-19, and in helping maybe realizing that COVID-19 could be just a symptom of a much larger problem with climate crisis. And the more we come together and we think together and we learn together, the faster we'll come up with answers to end the crisis at hand. So, with that, we need information, and let's provide that information, and let's listen to statements from the WHO and the Pan American Health Organization, and how these groups of doctors have done some research, and they're providing us with information on some of that research, and they are also focused on doing more of that research, and they are openly providing what they learn to us and our health officials. So let's listen to what is actually being said within these organizations. Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you for joining today's press briefing. Over the last week, the Americas reported over 753,000 new COVID infections and over 13,000 COVID-related deaths. In North America, cases in Canada and the United States remain steady but high, while infections and deaths have dropped by over 20% in Mexico. In Central America, every country except Panama has seen a reduction in cases and deaths over the last week. In South America, cases in the Southern Cone countries have increased steadily for the past several weeks. In the Andean region and in Brazil, cases are plateauing. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, cases are on the rise in the Cayman Islands and in Anguilla. This pandemic is dynamic, and the decisions we make about upholding preventive measures and expanding access to vaccines will influence how far this virus spreads. I want to address the new Omicron variant that was designated a variant of concern by the World Health Organization a few days ago. There are still many unknowns. It is not yet clear whether Omicron is more transmissible than other variants or if it causes more severe disease. But researchers around the world are actively conducting studies to better understand this variant so that we have the best available evidence to guide our actions. Over the weekend, PAHO was in touch with health ministers in our region to share details about this new variant, and we will continue to share updates and guidance as it becomes available. The virus still needs to be isolated to conduct neutralization tests, and this process will take some time. Until this test and other laboratory assays are completed, we will not have enough evidence to determine the degree of transmissibility or severity of the Omicron variant, or to assess the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines against it. PAHO, meanwhile, continues to closely track the other variants in our region, and for now, Delta remains the predominant variant in the Americas. Canada and Brazil are the only countries in our region where the Omicron variant has been detected. But it is likely that other countries will begin seeing this new variant in circulation soon. And that's why it's important that countries redouble their surveillance efforts, share sequences with the Genomic Surveillance Network of the Americas, and report any Omicron cases to the WHO. Speed and transparency are especially critical at this time. But above all, we urge people not to be frightened. Today, the most important thing that people can do to protect themselves is to get vaccinated and to reduce their risk of exposure to the virus. And this can be done by wearing masks, maintaining physical distance from others, frequent hand washing, and avoiding crowded spaces, especially indoors. It's important to note that these measures are effective against all variants, including Omicron. Countries should sustain their public health measures to limit transmission of the virus and adjust them accordingly to local transmission risks. As I've said before, vaccine inequity is prolonging the COVID crisis. And this is exactly what we're seeing with the arrival of Omicron. The more COVID-19 circulates, the more opportunities the virus has to mutate and to change. And that's why it is crucial that we expand vaccinations to all. So far, only 54% of people in Latin America and the Caribbean have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. So our region remains especially vulnerable. But COVID is not the first infectious disease that has shaken the world. For more than 40 years, scientists, countries, and communities have been grappling with the HIV epidemic. Today, as we commemorate World AIDS Day, PAHO honors those who lost their lives to this disease and those who over the years have fought for new tools to protect those living with HIV. Across Latin America and the Caribbean, 2.4 million people are living with HIV, and just 81% of them know their HIV status. With proper antiretroviral or ARV treatment, people living with HIV can keep their disease in check and avoid infecting others. But this requires consistent access to these drugs. Even before the pandemic, just 65% of people living with HIV in our region were receiving ARV therapy. And unfortunately, as the pandemic has progressed, more countries reported partial disruptions in services for antiretroviral therapy. But countries in the region, including ministries of health, civil society organizations, and international cooperation agencies, work together to maintain the supply of antiretroviral drugs for people living with HIV and for HIV prevention. They piloted innovative methods to get those who need it, such as dispensing multi-month supplies, loans between countries, and activating special procurement procedures. While regrettably our region is falling behind on the 2030 targets to reduce new HIV infections and to eliminate AIDS-related deaths, we have made significant progress. We also have effective drugs to control HIV and interrupt transmission. And we have COVID-19 vaccines, which are proven to be safe and effective for persons living with HIV. So now we must ensure consistent and equitable access to these powerful tools. But expanding access is only possible if we combat the persistent stigma and discrimination that keep health services out of reach from too many men who have sex with men, transgender women, and sex workers across our region. And that's why our AIDS elimination responses must reflect the cultural and sexual diversity, the gender equality, and human rights, with the active participation of the communities most affected. This week also marks 119 years since representatives from countries across the Americas met in Washington, D.C. for the first International Sanitary Convention of the American Republics. That would mark the creation of the Pan American Health Organization. For 119 years, PAHO has been working closely with countries in the Americas to generate knowledge, to guide public health actions, and to support our goal of health for all. Our anniversary reminds us of the importance of solidarity and collaboration to protect the health and well-being of our region, especially during health emergencies. We made a lot of progress in treating HIV/AIDS and developed effective vaccines to protect people from COVID-19 in record time. Now we must work together to finish the job and fulfill the promise of today's life-saving tools, so everyone in our region has access to the services and tools that they need to live healthy and productive lives.
Thank you, Dr. Etienne. We received a lot of questions on the variant Omicron, as expected. The first question is for you, Dr. Etienne. What is PAHO doing to track Omicron and other variants, in the Americas?
So thank you for this question. As I mentioned, we have informed health ministers over the weekend of developments with this new Omicron variant that was reported by South Africa on November 24th. And we have asked them to accelerate vaccination efforts and to continue with crucial public health measures. Today, the Delta variant continues to be the most prevalent one in our region. And no matter which variant, we urge people to continue wearing their masks, social distancing, avoiding large gatherings, especially indoors, and hand washing. Together with vaccination, these public health measures continue to be the most efficient actions to reduce the spread of SARS-CoV-2 virus, to reduce hospitalizations, and to save lives. Our guidance to health authorities is also to enhance their genomic surveillance efforts and to share genomic sequences and samples with our regional genomic surveillance network of the Americas. And the regional network has already performed some over 175,000 virus sequences from 26 laboratories in PAHO's member states in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is a wide coverage. In addition to the genomic surveillance, we are also working with the laboratories to rapidly implement a molecular screening methodology for the early alert for the possibility or possible introduction of Omicron, even in countries where the sequencing is not yet fully established. So we've asked countries to continue reporting cases or clusters of cases, including that any that may be associated with the Omicron variant through the International Health Regulations, IHR. But as I said, there is still much to learn about the Omicron variant of concern. We don't know if it is more transmissible. We don't know whether it causes more severe disease and how vaccines and diagnostic tests will perform, how effective treatments may be, or what clinical characteristics can be described. But we do know that we must continue to do everything that we can to reduce the heavy impact that the COVID-19 pandemic continues to inflict on our economies and our societies and our peoples. Especially now, as we get closer to the holiday season, it's more important than ever to maintain caution, to reduce the possibility of exposure to COVID-19, and to protect ourselves and our families. Now, we can do this by getting vaccinated when you're eligible and taking the proven measures of maintaining the physical distancing, hand washing, wearing of masks, enclosed spaces, avoided confined and crowded spaces, etc., and ensuring good ventilation indoors. As we have stressed over these 22 months, we need to do both, get vaccinated, but also adhere to the public health measures, even for people who have already been vaccinated.
Thank you, Dr. Etienne. Seguimos entonces a las otras preguntas.
So we now move on to the other questions. We continue with the Omicron variant. We start with a general question from CNN in Spanish and La Prensa Panama. What can we expect with this variant? What is the official information that we have so far on this variant in connection with fatality rate, transmission, and responsiveness to the vaccine? Dr. Aldigueri. Thank you very much for those questions. I think that Dr. Etienne has shared with you quite a good deal of information. I am going to highlight and also share other details regarding specific issues. It is too early to predict the impact of the Omicron variant in terms of transmissibility, severity, or also departure from the immune response. It is too early. That variant has some of the mutations that were previously described for the three variants of concern, Alpha, Beta, and Delta. And the information that we have available so far is insufficient to be able to inform its behavior in case community circulation is established. That's the reason why currently many labs, many reference labs at the global and world level are also advancing lab tests to obtain information on its ability to transmit and also immune responses, be it natural or vaccine-induced. And here we're talking about replication, neutralization tests, and also infection capability in animals. On the other hand, it is also important to recall that no vaccine has 100% effectiveness, and all of the vaccines that have been authorized for emergency use by WHO have been efficient to protect against all of the circulating variants by diminishing drastically in a very significant fashion the risk of hospitalization and the risk of death. Given all that, we have no evidence to think that the performance of those vaccines to protect against Omicron would be different. I am going to refer to other aspects that have already been referred by Dr. Etienne. From the designation of Omicron as a variant of concern on November 26th, last Friday, work has been done to alert the countries on its genomic sequencing. And due to those surveillance systems, Omicron has been detected in 23 countries, including 2 countries in the Americas. In the 2 countries of the America, detection has taken place in travelers. They are significant cases, and we have not seen community transmission yet. So it is important to recall that the increase in the number of cases or new outbreaks have to do with factorial aspects. The emergence of a new variant is just another aspect and not necessarily the most important one. As we have already mentioned in several occasions, all of the public health control measures implemented, such as wearing masks, social distancing, and full vaccination, continue to be the most effective manner to limit the transmission of any variant of concern, and they should be maintained. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. As you know, today is a momentous day for global health. Today, WHO's member states decided to embark on the process of drafting and negotiating a new convention, agreement, or other international instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. The significance of this decision cannot be overstated. Just as countries have united in the past to adopt treaties against tobacco, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, climate change, and more, and so today, the nations of the world have made a strong statement that health security is too important to be left to chance or goodwill, or shifting geopolitical currents or vested interests. A convention, agreement, or other international instrument will not solve every problem, but it will provide the overarching framework to foster greater international cooperation and provide a platform for strengthening global health security. In their decision today, member states agreed to establish an intergovernmental negotiating body to begin drafting and negotiating a new accord. They committed to holding their first meeting by the 1st of March next year and to submit the outcome of their negotiations to the World Health Assembly in 2024. That may seem like a long process, and it is, but we should not be naive in thinking that reaching a global accord on pandemics will be easy. The idea of an international instrument on tobacco control was formally initiated in 1995. But the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control did not enter into force until a decade later. Of course, we hope that this process will not take nearly that long. But there are still differences of opinion about what a new accord could or should not contain. Nevertheless, today countries have proven to each other and the world that differences can be overcome and common ground can be found. The spirit of solidarity that we have seen today is what we need, not just to prevent and mitigate the impact of future pandemics, but to end this one. The emergence of the Omicron variant has understandably captured global attention. At least 23 countries from 5 of 6 WHO regions have now reported cases of Omicron, and we expect that number to grow. WHO takes this development extremely seriously, and so should every country. But it should not surprise us. This is what viruses do. And it's what this virus will continue to do as long as we allow it to continue spreading. We're learning more all the time about Omicron, but there is still more to learn about its effect on transmission, severity of disease, and the effectiveness of tests, therapeutics, and vaccines. Several WHO advisory groups have met over the last couple of days to evaluate the emerging evidence and prioritize the studies needed to answer these questions. I thank Botswana and South Africa for detecting, sequencing, and reporting this variant so rapidly. It's deeply concerning to me that those countries are now being penalized by others for doing the right thing. We call on all countries to take rational, proportional risk reduction measures in keeping with international health regulations. This includes measures to delay or reduce the spread of the new variant, such as screening of passengers prior to traveling and or upon arrival, or the application of quarantine to international travelers. Blanket travel bans will not prevent the international spread of Omicron, and they place a heavy burden on lives and livelihoods. WHO continues to call on all countries to optimize public health and social measures and ensure that high-risk and vulnerable individuals in all countries are fully vaccinated immediately. At the same time, we must not forget that we are already dealing with a highly transmissible, dangerous variant, the Delta variant, which currently accounts for almost all cases globally. We need to use the tools we already have to prevent transmission and save lives from Delta. And if we do that, we will also prevent transmission and save lives from Omicron. But if countries and individuals don't do what they need to do to stop transmission of Delta, they won't stop Omicron either. Globally, we have a toxic mix of low vaccine coverage and very low testing, a recipe for breeding and amplifying variants. That's why we continue to urge countries to fully fund the ACT Accelerator to ensure equitable access to vaccines, tests, therapeutics all over the world. As we mark World AIDS Day, we're reminded that more than 40 years into the global AIDS epidemic, we still have no vaccine and no cure for this disease. 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, we have not one, but many vaccines and many other effective tools. This virus has demonstrated that it will not simply disappear. How many more lives and livelihoods it takes is up to us. Ending the pandemic is not a matter of chance. It is a matter of choice. Christian, back to you.
Thank you very much, Director General. Let me now open the floor for questions, and to remind everyone, please unmute yourself when you're called upon. And we will start with Sophie Mokena from South African Broadcasting Corporation. Sophie, please unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. I just want to find out, you spoke about the issue of the variant, the new variant that was detected by South Africa. The decision by developed countries such as UK, United States of America, and the EU to impose travel restrictions against SADC member countries has led to a loss of economic spin-off, or it has got a negative impact on the economy of these countries that are still struggling to rebuild their economies after, due to COVID-19. What is your message to the globe in terms of what must they do when there are information such as this? Because this will lead to the deterrent where you'll find countries not sharing information.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I'll hand over to Dr. Shuad Majur, Assistant Director General, Emergency Preparedness and IHR.
Thank you very much for this very important question. In fact, there is some modelings that shows that travel ban may be helpful in the beginning of an outbreak to give more time to countries to be prepared to the spread. But it is clear that a travel ban cannot stop the circulation of virus, and more importantly, the traveler can jeopardize the effort to fight against the outbreak. This is why we call that all countries should apply comprehensive measures from the countries of departure and the countries of arrival, and using risk-based approach and evidence-based approach on the situation to take a comprehensive measure, including testing, including checking of symptoms and others. And these measures could be more effective to prevent the spread of the new variant.
Thank you very much. And Dr. van Kerkhoff.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank the scientists from South Africa and Botswana and all over the world who are working with us to share this information in almost real time. The detection of this variant in South Africa was reported to us through our technical advisory group for virus evolution very quickly, and immediately, we held meetings where information analysis was shared with us and with our partners, the advisory group for virus evolution, so that decisions could be made. And I think that should be commended. What should also be commended is the improvements and enhancements of testing and sequencing that have happened throughout the course of this pandemic, particularly in South Africa, but also in Southern Africa. There are a lot of efforts that are underway, and of course, this needs to continue to be improved. We need investment in this. But we need countries to continue to do surveillance for SARS-CoV-2, whichever virus is circulating. And remember, Delta is dominant. But the more the virus circulates, the more opportunities it has to change. So we need to strengthen our surveillance around the world. We need to strengthen our genomic sequencing around the world, make sure that we have better geographic representation all over the planet, and that information continues to be shared with us. We do not want to see countries penalized for sharing information, because this is how WHO and our partners, this is how we make assessments and how we provide advice. So I do want to say a special thank you to so many researchers across South Africa. I wish I had the list of institutions in front of me, but there are many, for the great work that they do and will continue to do, and to thank them for reporting this to us in such an open manner, and as well as to scientists in other countries that continue to do the same.
Thank you. Next question goes to Robin Millard from Agence France Presse. Robin, please unmute yourself. Robin Millard, AFP.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. On Omicron, the most optimistic scenario is that Omicron ultimately turns out to be both more transmissible and less dangerous than Delta. If that turned out to be the case, what would that actually mean in practical terms for the world in the months ahead? Thank you.
Dr. Van Kerkhove?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. So there are a lot of different scenarios that we're considering for Omicron, and of course, it's still very early days in terms. Okay. Okay, so it's still very early days in terms of our understanding of this variant, and again, we're grateful for the information that's coming in daily. There is the possibility, we don't have all the information yet on transmission in terms of if there is a fitness advantage, if it's more transmissible. There is some suggestion of that, but again, it's early days. We expect to have more information on transmission within days, not necessarily weeks, but in days. In terms of the severity profile, we have seen reports of cases with Omicron that go from mild disease all the way to severe disease. There is some indication that some of the patients are presenting with mild disease, but again, it's early days, and we do have a surveillance bias right now in terms of the cases that are being detected. There is also a suggestion of increased hospitalizations across South Africa, but that could be a factor of the sheer fact that we have more cases. And if you have more cases, you'll have more hospitalizations. So with regards to severity, there are studies that are underway looking at hospitalizations, looking at those individuals who are hospitalized, whether or not they have this variant or not. And we're also getting a picture of some of the cases that are detected in other countries. So as the Director General mentioned, there are reports of Omicron in 23 countries. We expect that number to change. And it's important that information on these cases are also shared with us so that we learn more. But it is certainly possible that one of the scenarios is that the virus, as it continues to evolve, may still have a fitness advantage, meaning that it could become more transmissible than Delta. We'll have to see. But we don't know quite yet about the severity. I do think we should caution about sort of a best case, worst case scenario. The more this virus circulates, the more infections there will be. The more infections there will be, the more people will die. And this is something that can be prevented. So everything that we can do for Delta, which is dominant worldwide, needs to be applied and strengthened for Omicron. So however this unfolds, the way that we act now, the decisions that are taken now in every country, will benefit however Omicron unfolds.
And Dr. Swaminathan, please.
Just to add to what Maria said, I think it's also very important for countries to really strengthen, expand vaccination coverage, especially in the priority populations. We know that it's people above 45 with underlying comorbidities who are at highest risk of developing severe disease after getting infection, whether it's Omicron or Delta or any of the variants. And we know that vaccines are likely to have some protection. We still need to find out if there's any loss of protection, but we think vaccines will still protect against severe disease as they have against the other variants. So this is a call for countries to really look at their own data, look at the groups that have been vaccinated, where are the gaps, what can be done really to get people who've been unwilling or who may have difficulties in accessing the vaccination sites. So we really need to look very practically at the delivery constraints, and also a call to all countries who are donating vaccines. We're very thankful, but we would like to see some advanced visibility and transparency in when the doses will be available, which doses will be available. Companies need to tell us very clearly how the supplies are going to flow through COVAX. This is the time that we need increased vaccines to flow through COVAX to the countries, and we are going to prioritize countries with low coverage. And so I think it's a wake-up sign for us, as the DG has said many times, to really think about, as a world, what do we do with available vaccine supplies now, and how can we get them into the arms of people who haven't been vaccinated yet? Thank you.
Thank you very much, both. We have a long line of interested journalists, and we continue with Andrew Joseph from Stat News. Andrew, please unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I appreciate it. So when some of these neutralization studies start coming out on Omicron, can you explain how, I guess, people should interpret them and how they could be used to make any potential policy decisions on vaccine design or boosters or whatever else? Like, so what's the significance of a 5-fold drop versus a 50-fold drop? And at what point is that worrisome? And how much can these studies actually tell us about protection against more severe outcomes? Thank you.
Dr. Swaminathan, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can start, others might want to add. So the ways in which we assess immunity to this infection, or when, either to natural infection or when vaccination is given, is through looking most commonly at neutralizing antibodies. So antibodies, of course, bind to the virus and prevent them from infecting the human cells by binding to the spike protein. And so if you already have these antibodies in your system, then when you're exposed to the virus, it can actually prevent the virus from getting in, or even if it gets in, prevent it from multiplying and causing disease. Now, there are other arms of the immune system. As you know, there's cell-mediated immunity through the T cells, and these also play a very major role in protecting against severe disease particularly, but they're less easy to measure. And so most studies are done using neutralizing antibodies, but it's important to remember that. So the drops in antibody titers actually tell us, whether what's the approximate level of antibodies you need in the blood to really feel that you're protected. And unfortunately, we do not have a consensus on what we call a correlative protection. We cannot go out and say this is the number above which you are protected, or this is the number below which you are vulnerable. It's a range, and there's a range above which we think most people are going to be protected. These kind of studies are helpful, particularly when we're looking at different vaccines that have been used to see whether, if any one vaccine or group of vaccines is more effective, but also it tells us whether we need to make changes in the vaccine. And this is the kind of data that the TAG COVAC, which has been set up by WHO, will be looking at. They're already meeting and deliberating on the criteria that may be used to recommend a change in vaccine composition. And so we also have a meeting. The R&D Blueprint is organizing a meeting on December 6th to discuss the data that's now currently available around the world on neutralizing antibodies, not just against this variant, but the whole body of work. There's quite a lot of data now to see whether we can start coming towards some agreement on some correlates of protection. So at the moment, it's important that labs around the world that are doing this do it in a standardized way. And again, this is why the R&D Blueprint expert groups on animal models and assays has been meeting to decide who's going to do which studies, what assays are going to be, how they're going to be standardized, which are the priority assays, and also to help the virus samples and the reagents to move around the world. And this is one of the reasons why travel bans can pose challenges and difficulties to researchers and countries, because we do need at this time a free movement of reagents, of lab consumables, samples. That's going to advance our understanding as fast as possible. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
M. Trudeau, est-ce que le Canada a assez de doses de vaccins pour administrer une troisième dose à tous les adultes actuellement?
Évidemment, tout d'abord, on est en train de suivre les recommandations de NACI des experts. On va faire les étapes nécessaires selon ce qu'ils recommandent, mais je peux vous dire que l'accès aux vaccins, la quantité de vaccins n'est pas un enjeu pour nous. On en a énormément, on en a assez actuellement et on va en recevoir dans les semaines, les mois à venir. On a signé des contrats pour octobre 2022 qui nous assure que quels que soient les besoins, les recommandations des experts, on va en avoir assez pour tout le monde. In terms of boosters, our first priority is following the recommendations of NACI, of the experts in terms of when they should happen, what's the impact of the Omicron variant on that. There is not an issue about quantity of vaccines. We have lots of vaccines for boosters in Canada. We're receiving more into the new year. We are fine in terms of quantity. The issue is what is the best recommendation for people to get those boosters and when. On va commencer à les mettre en vigueur le plus rapidement possible. Maintenant, on a compris que même ce qu'on a, c'est-à-dire tous les voyageurs à l'international qui arrivent sont vaccinés, tous les voyageurs qui arrivent ont pris un test pré-embarquement. Maintenant, on va mettre cette extra couche de gens qui vont devoir se faire dépister à l'arrivée. Puis dès qu'on est capable de le faire dans les jours à venir, on va le faire. On faisait déjà du dépistage aléatoire. Ce qu'on est en train de faire, c'est d'augmenter pour que ce soit là pour tout le monde. Et on s'attend à ce que ça soit fait dans les jours ou la semaine ou deux qui viennent.
Just quickly on Huawei, can I just get quickly on Huawei? What is taking so long to ban or approve Huawei?
We continue to follow the advice of our science, our experts, our intelligence and security analysts. We're working with the various telcos to ensure that there's a competitive environment, but that, of course, the safety and protection of Canadians is always there. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Minister Alghabra, have you made a decision with regards to the people coming into the country from the United States as to whether or not they're going to be tested? Minister Duclos was supposed to talk to his provincial counterparts last night.
Yeah. So, look, we made a decision right now about testing every traveler coming in from around the world other than the U.S. And we are having discussions, Mr. Duclos yesterday, with his provincial counterpart. So we need to be prepared and ready if we need to adjust that decision to include travelers from the U.S. We haven't made that decision yet. There are these conversations.
When is it coming? When is that decision coming? When is that decision coming?
I don't know. I don't know.
Are we talking days? Are we talking
depending on the changing situation, depending on the conditions in the U.S. So it's still very fluid, but if circumstances change, we will change our decision.
Are you expecting like a decision from the United States on their own testing rules before you decide if you're going to test or not?
No. The U.S. will make its own decisions based on its own information and own circumstances. Thank you. The circumstances. It's all based on the circumstances. Yeah, the epidemiology in the U.S., around the world. These are the circumstances that we use to make decisions. Thank you.
I wonder if you could say if the airlines are really worried about the border rules. Are you going to be an advocate in there for the airlines and the tourist industry who don't like these border rules at all?
As I said yesterday to the Tourism Industry Association of Canada, safety first, then travel. The Canadian economy will not recover until the tourism economy does. We have to stay safe. Thank you.
Bonjour, Mme Saint-Don. Je voudrais savoir quelle est votre position sur les Jeux de Pékin, les demandes de boycott diplomatique. Qu'est-ce qui fait en sorte que vous n'avez pas pris de décision, à savoir si vous allez emboîter le pas aux Américains?
La décision n'a pas encore été prise. On est toujours en discussion avec les alliés. Pour le gouvernement, évidemment, respecte l'indépendance des comités olympiques et paralympiques canadiens. Et moi, en tant que ministre des Sports, ma priorité, c'est évidemment la sécurité des athlètes et leur succès.
La présence diplomatique.
What do you think about the Olympics in China? Should we have a diplomatic representation in your mind? Should we boycott it? What's your position?
Well, I'll start by saying that I've been having this conversation for 13 or 14 years because, as you're probably aware, I carried the flag for Canada at the Beijing Summer Olympics in 2008. And we had this conversation about whether the spotlight being on China could create positive change at the time, and I still believe that it is. We are having this conversation today because the Olympics are in China and because the genocide is a reality, but the Olympics always cast a brighter light on issues around the world. A good friend of mine from a large magazine reached out and asked, you know, if we could have a conversation, and it's my view that the Olympics do a good job shining a light.
But okay, we shine light, but nothing changes, and China says, hey, we're making all this dough with the Olympics. Is it enough just to shine light if we don't actually do some things?
The light is just the first step, in my view. And the issue with you know, whether there's a diplomatic boycott, we'll leave that up to the diplomats and the leadership to determine. I'm just insistent that our athletes, you know, are not tools of diplomacy. We have trade, we have embassies, we have ambassadors, we have international students, we have lots of different ways to work thoughtfully as government. But our athletes, they're meant to be non-political.
But
the argument that is being made is that the athletes are being used as diplomatic tools by China.
I would disagree.
Doesn't it send the wrong message, though, to have Canadian athletes walking into the National Stadium in Beijing, waving to the crowd when not a year earlier China had kidnapped 2 of our citizens?
It's a fair point.
Do you view that it says the wrong
Can you
message?
just elaborate on that? You said you disagree that the athletes
Are being used?
Yeah.
I don't think that the athletes are being used. I don't think they're being used by competing in a country. Our athletes went to Russia and competed in Sochi, and the conversation around LGBTQ2+ inclusion was never before such, you know, in the spotlight, and it changed the conversation at the Canadian Olympic team. It changed the conversation at the IOC level. When I was chair of the Athletes Commission with the Canadian Olympic Committee, we then changed the charter to include LGBTQ2+ inclusion in the anti-discrimination policy. The Olympics are a big thing, and I'll acknowledge that, you know, they're they're complicated and nuanced and complex, but I don't believe that athletes are ever being used.
Can we go back to the Michael's argument? So are you saying that athletes should have been in Beijing even if the Michaels had still been in prison?
That's a hypothetical question. I won't address it.
Aren't Canadian athletes also citizens, and shouldn't they also care about what happened to the Michaels and not, you know, why should they be in China?
They should absolutely care, and I think you can compete in a country and still care about these issues. I don't think that being an athlete, caring about our athletes, or cheering for our athletes is mutually exclusive from believing in and caring about the Uyghur genocide.
But Mr. Vancouver, on a diplomatic boycott, I mean, there's the broader issues of Russia and their treatment of people, and then there's the direct targeting of Canadian citizens in an act of hostage diplomacy. I mean, it's a completely different level of direct threat, is it not? And invites a response based on what was done.
It was an example, not a comparison.
I just want to ask you about the motion, Alexis Brunel-Ducerf's motion to push the games back. Postpone. Thank you, merci. A year. Why did you agree with that?
Alexis and Martin and I went for a beer last night, and we had a really long conversation. We had, I won't say more than one beer, but we went for a beer last night, and we're good friends. We know how to disagree thoughtfully and to have a nuanced conversation about a very complex issue. And what we agreed on was that it is possible to believe in our athletes, to cheer for our athletes, and to support Team Canada, and still care deeply about what's going on in China from a human rights perspective. Thank you, guys.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de la situation à Québec, les policiers, ces arrestations?
Je trouve que, comme tout le monde, je pense que j'ai été choqué par les images qu'on a vues, puis il faut que la lumière soit faite sur cet incident-là. Je veux dire, quand on voit un policier pousser de la neige sur le visage de quelqu'un qui est déjà atterré, je pense que ça choque, ça a de quoi choquer la conscience.
Est-ce que ça dit quelque chose du service de police de Québec, des gens de Québec? Est-ce qu'il faut tirer des conclusions?
Je pense que c'est toujours très hasardeux de faire des généralisations, quelles qu'elles soient. Donc, mais je pense qu'il faut que la lumière soit faite sur cette intervention-là, définitivement. Puis s'il y a des problèmes systémiques et de culture, ben ça doit être analysé également.
Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de la réponse des autorités?
Je pense que pour l'instant, il faut juste qu'il y ait une enquête et qu'on vienne à bout des questions qui sont légitimement soulevées suite à cette intervention.
Quel genre d'enquête? L'enquête interne, externe? Est-ce que vous voyez?
Personnellement, je vais laisser le soin aussi à Québec de faire son travail. Ce n'est pas de notre ressort, mais personnellement, j'ai toujours cru qu'il est mieux d'avoir des enquêtes externes sur ce genre d'incident. Merci.
Merci.
PBO has a report out on Indigenous water advisories.
Sure.
It says that you're spending enough money from a capital perspective to be able to address the timeline problem on the timeline you've set out, but that the operational funding isn't there.
I'd have to look at the report. This is something that I've been keenly interested in, obviously, in my former role and current role with the same relationship with chiefs that want to see clean water in their communities. Clearly, what we saw before the former Auditor General, the current Auditor General's last report, was that gap in financing for operations and maintenance. Now, that's the funding amount, but what's also important is the homegrown solution. So training up local folks to run the water operating plants, expansion of those plants if necessary, over multi-year funding formulas. We knew from the get-go when I sat down with my team a year and a half ago, that the 80% formula was just effective and had been defective for some time. So we moved that up to 100% formula. The current funding that we announced in this past December will effectively quadruple the amounts in operations and maintenance into communities. And we're willing to look at more solutions if we think the recommendations from the auditor hit home and are indeed accurate. That's something I want to look at, and I'll look at with Minister Haidu.
Is this going to be an ongoing challenge? Because some of these communities are very small. Any community of that size would struggle to, keep a technician there, especially if they're in high demand.
Oh, absolutely, and that's one of the first things that we saw is a lot of those communities, those members are the pride of their community, and if they're seeing a better salary offered in another, often non-Indigenous, why would I fault them for jumping at them? But it is the reality of those communities, and we can work with them with a number of there's circuit rider solutions that, for example, Manitoba has been amazing at doing, Quebec as well. We just have to have more saturation of those options and making sure that local folks are trained up to be the pride of their community and operating something that's such an essential asset. So absolutely it will be a challenge ongoing, but it's something we're willing to meet.
Do you have to...
Oh, sorry. Is the government going to set a new date for ending the drinking water advisory?
Look, I would direct you to the website that shows exactly what the plans are in for each community. We have said with those communities that we're willing to work at their pace. There are a number of communities, and it's their choice, that have decided to keep the long-term water drinking advisories on in the face of water that is testing clean, or medium-term solutions. And they said, no, we want a long-term solution, and we respect that. So, but you'd have to look at each individual community, and there are a number of communities that have large capital projects left, and they will take a little time.
The government made a mistake at setting a hard and firm deadline that we're not even close to meeting? Or?
Look, I give credit to the Prime Minister of standing up and saying enough is enough. That is a shot to the civil service to get things going, and he stood up and put the money in place. So you look back at it in the face of a global pandemic. I'm very proud of people standing up, but we have to be truthful with our timelines to Canadians who are looking for answers. But behind all that is the resolve of this government to continue investing in essential water and essential assets in communities.
When you're designing the capital system, are you taking operations into mind and future, and are you trying to, lessen the operational burden going forward?
making them easier to
So
operate?
it's hard to generalize on that point. Obviously, we want the solutions that work for the community. We will work with their capital asset plans and the bidding procedure, which can be quite complex in a remote community where you perhaps have one contractor or two contractors, and given the influx of capital investments in Indigenous communities, those people are in high demand. So there are challenges there, and obviously we work with the community in their maintenance and needs as a matter of a resource. We also have to be conscious of the fact that as a federal government, we can't be dictating terms to Indigenous communities. So it's a question of cooperation at the end of the day. It does vary from community to community.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Just wondering about getting some of the vaccines Canada has or has access to African countries, developing countries. I wonder if you can speak to the work that your government's doing to make sure the vaccine equity issue.
No, absolutely. I think it's a really important one. One, as we stated from the beginning, that the vaccine rollout for the world is so important because no one is safe until everybody has the vaccines. We've committed up to right now up to 200 million doses, the equivalent of 200 million doses. But we're more importantly working with the World Health Organization through COVAX to making sure it's an equitable distribution. So this is not just about vaccine rollout. We're pooling the world's donations to come up with an equitable plan and making sure it's done appropriately. But this also includes the challenges that we have to deal with. So, for example, some nations are going to have different abilities to be able to absorb the vaccines. So in some places where we have vaccines, we've had challenges where they can't absorb it and where they've actually said, listen, can you wait until we get things set up? And I don't want to list those countries just yet. We're trying to get a handle on that. And unfortunately, we're also dealing with the issue of vaccine hesitancy. There are some nations even in Africa where they have dealt with issues of the secondary impacts of the pandemic because of the supply chain. It actually has prevented other health services that they normally get that has a detrimental impact. So we have to kind of deal with that aspect as well. So they haven't seen the direct impact of the pandemic, which is kind of contributing to vaccine hesitancy. And I also have to say that certain leaderships of people in important positions have not pushed the importance of the vaccines as well. So leadership does matter there. So we're all coming together. I'm confident that the world is going to come together through COVAX to get this done, and I want to assure Canadians that Canada will be playing a very important role to convene and coordinate this response.
So what kind of position does that put Canada in when you have certain provinces considering booster shots for either wider populations or some populations, they are for some populations already, when you have executives in COVAX saying, no, richer countries, we need you to donate more to us. What kind of a difficult position does that put Canada in trying to decide how to either roll out boosters or donate more?
So first of all, we need to look at it as the vaccine rollout between boosters and the first and second dose is very different. For example, certain boosters could be different based on the first and second dose. But having said that, we as a nation proactively ordered through the great work of procurement ordered a number of vaccines. And we know in Canada where Canadians have kind of relied upon which vaccines. So we do have many vaccines that are going to be in surplus, and those are what we were also committing to donate our surplus vaccines to COVAX. That's in addition to the approximate 200 million vaccine doses there. So one thing I can assure you, Canadians will not be impacted. We'll make sure that they're going to be looked after in terms of their first and second dose, obviously. And we want to encourage the Canadians to get get vaccinated. And more importantly, making sure that the children are also vaccinated. I know my son's going to be vaccinated this Saturday. So encourage everybody to get their children vaccinated as well. But more importantly, the third dose, as we look at the different variants that are out there, that the Canadians will be looked after for the third dose. But having said this, we will be working together with the rest of the world, and Canada will do its part, and we will constantly review where we can provide that support. Vaccines is one piece, but we also need to look at the medical support and the PP issue as well. But we also have to be able to provide, do they have the ability to provide that support? And those are the conversations that I still need to have with the partners, and I look forward to once it's appropriate for me to be able to travel and go to Geneva and have those conversations. Thank you.
Thank you for listening today, and you've been listening to Policy and Rates here on Depictions Media Radio, and of course I've been your host, Michael Clogs. I want to leave you with thinking that, hey, information is empowerment. The more we arm ourselves with information, the more we learn, the more empowered we become. The more empowered we become, the less dependent we become on just simply what politicians are saying to us, what government and elected officials are just saying to us. The more we can voice an opinion to them as to how do we take a direction. Directions that we're heading in a society need to be a group effort, not just a simple bilateral effort presented by a governing body. It needs to be a reflection of all of us as people, a united effort by all people. As Dr. Marie Karkoff said, that it's called a pandemic because there are no countries that are not involved. And we need to involve all of those countries, whether they are mechanized and have deep bank accounts and resources to rule commerce over people, versus the smallest of countries that have little